Hi everyone. In this video, I am going to walk you through some very simple changes that I would make to a rental property if I were either the landlady or the tenant in the space. It's a property that caught my eye recently, a granny flat, a one-bedroom granny flat that's up for rent. And it caught my eye because it's a nice enough space. It's a space that I could see myself living in. But then as an interior designer, I automatically started to see the areas that might prove problematic to somebody who is living there on a long-term basis and start imagining the ways in which I would make improvements if I had the opportunity to. So I thought I would make a video outlining what those changes are because it could be helpful. It could inspire you to make some easy changes yourself in your own space, whether you own or rent. And I'm going to talk you through not just what I would do, but why I would do it. So if that sounds like something of interest, stick along and we'll get into it. Okay, so first let's have a quick look at the whole space. In this corner that we're looking at, it's the lounge area with a view from the kitchen. And this is a better look at that corner. And here we're looking across the room to a work from home corner. And we also see the main entry into the flat. And lastly, we see the kitchen area. So it's quite compact, but the island unit provides useful storage prep and dining space. Overall, I would say this space needs a mix of materials. There's an awful lot of wood. In fact, almost everything is wood. The other thing I think that's missing here is some circles. There's a lot of rectangles, a lot of sharp corners. And so just for a mix of materials and a mix of shapes and also a bit of softening, I would look to introduce some alternatives to wood and some circular shapes. And the overall style of furniture and decor is reasonably cohesive. It's not a horrible mishmash, but for me, it is just a tad off. So with the changes I'll be suggesting, I'll be looking to improve that. So one of the glaring issues for long-term functionality in the space is storage. These three small units are all that's provided. And while the space is small, there is potential to dramatically increase storage without spreading out too much. And that is by using the vertical space, which from a storage point of view has been completely ignored. If I got my hands on this space, I'd be putting in a unit along these lines. So I would go wider than the current unit, but also go up to the ceiling with additional shelving. And a tenant could do something like this quite easily without needing to go the built-in route. Take one of these standard shelving units, multiply them by 3, add a shelf across the top. So you're getting the effect of this built-in unit with only a single wall-mounted shelf, as opposed to a whole fully built-in unit. And you're achieving so much storage into the bargain. Then add some neat baskets along the bottom so you have some clothes storage, and use the open shelves to display books, plants, photos, and other keepsakes. So in terms of the layout, I would stick with what they have. They have put the sofa in the right place, and I would add the storage on the same wall the TV is currently placed at. And the reason for that is while you're seated on the sofa in this position, the kitchen is out of your sight. The desk would be in your peripheral vision, but the view of the garden is more likely to draw your eye. Whereas if you put the sofa on the opposite wall to the one it's on now, then the view of the kitchen would be very distracting when you're sitting in that area. And that would just make it harder to wind down when you're hopefully looking to be in relaxation mode when you're sitting in that spot. Likewise, if you place the sofa under the window, you'd be looking across at your desk and you'd completely lose the view of the garden. So the current layout is spot on and I would stick with that. The artwork, however, is too high, so I would drop them lower. Personally, I'd be inclined to replace the duo with a single larger piece and make sure it's landscape, not portrait. so that it aligns with the space. Now, the other thing that you could do here is place a mirror. That would be a great option as well, because mirrors placed near natural light sources bounce that light around, which helps to create a sense of more space, as well as making a darker space a bit brighter. And this window is the main source of natural light in this open plan space. We do have some light at the front door, and there might be a small window in this corner of the kitchen. But this window is the main source of light, so a large mirror on this wall will be very helpful. And then next, I would remove this coffee table. It's taking up too much space, making the area feel constricted. And I know I'd be whacking my shins off its sharp corners a lot. So for me, that has to go. So I'd be inclined to replace it with a poof or an ottoman. So this would bring softness to the space, as well as adding a comfy and functional footrest. And if you wanted to put your cup on it, you can simply add a small tray. There was a small tray on the table. So you could just add that to the poof. But actually, I'd be looking to this existing little shelving unit to place my cup or a glass of vino on. So I would swap its position with this plug-in radiator. This is a mobile plug-in radiator that you can move around. So I would swap their positions. And I think with the radiator, they have the right idea in terms of hanging this blanket over it. But I would get one that's big enough to cover the radiator fully. And I would also make sure it's the same colour as the wall so that it blends into the background and is less noticeable, especially as by swapping it, it'll now be even more prominent. And that is a tip in general. If there's something that you want to fade into the background and not be noticed, then make it the same colour as the background. So ugly features like radiators would ideally be painted the same colour as the wall and not be left white in stark contrast to the wall, because that makes them stand out. So if you want it to blend in, paint it the same colour. If you want to highlight it, paint it a contrasting colour. So now let's take a look at the sofa. It's pretty unremarkable, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it needs replacing. However, for all the plainness of the colour palette here, the sofa looks quite busy. There seems to be two throws on it and there's quite a lot of cushions. So I would pare all of that back. And I replace the smaller throws with a single one that's large enough to fully cover the sofa. And I'd be opting for bringing in a little colour here, but a colour block rather than a busy pattern. And then I'd reduce the number of cushions. The next thing I would do in this corner is add a rug. Again, this is an opportunity to bring in a bit of colour, also more softness. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots of hard angles, there's not enough softness in the overall space as a whole. And a rug will help with that, as well as zoning this corner as the relaxation area of a multifunctional space. The other two corners serve a productive function. This one should maximise the chill out vibes. And then lastly, I'd add a slim profile lamp. I'm going for metal finish here rather than wood, just to add to the mix of materials. As I mentioned earlier, there's already an abundance of wood in the overall space, and a bit of variety is needed for visual interest. Now, before we move on, I just want to say that you might have expected me to add curtains here, but actually I'm just going to stick with the blinds. There isn't enough wall space either side of the window for me to feel comfortable adding curtains here. They will block some of the light, and as already discussed, it's the main source of natural light, so I'm leaving them be. So here is an overview of how the space might look and feel compared to this. And this is just one other option that you could consider here instead of the poof, and that's a small circular glass coffee table, smaller than the existing one and circular because that will make it easier to maneuver around in the tight space. And glass, again, for a different material to make it feel more visually interesting. Okay, so let's move our attention to the entryway. So I'd start by removing this small shelving unit. Its functionality has now been replaced by the taller units to the left. And I'd also remove the mirror. Now I know what I said about reflecting natural light, but I'll come back to this later. In this particular spot, I want that wall space to serve a different purpose. And while they're in the shot, I'll also mention these cushions and the high stools. I would replace these cushions and stools, but I'll come back to them when we're looking at the kitchen area. The next thing I'd do is I'd move this chair beside the desk over to where the bookcase is right now. It doesn't serve much purpose where it is. Inside the door, it can be a useful spot to sit and remove shoes when you enter the flat. And in place of the mirror, I'd add some hooks for coats. So now we have a place to hang things as soon as we enter and to sit and put our slippers on. What I would also add here is a small closed storage unit which can store some shoes. And I've chosen a metal finish here, again to add in an alternative to wood. This would also be a handy spot to add a lamp and also a little bowl to keep your keys handy and easy to find. So let's have a quick look at the before again and the after. Okay, let's look at the desk area now. First of all, I want to admire this desk. It looks like an authentic mid-century desk, but nothing around it is doing it any justice. So right now we've got 2 lamps, a tray, a small plant, which I think is fake, and 2 small trinkets, plus an ugly office chair. Remember, the other chair has now moved across the entryway. So the first thing I would, and centre it more on the wall now that the chair has gone. Then there's this artwork hanging above the desk, and like the art over the sofa, it's hung too high, and it's also proportionately too small for the wall space. I would replace it completely with a much larger piece. You could go either portrait or landscape, and I think landscape would be better. But then the other option, which is what I would personally do, is to add a round mirror. So remember, I've removed the mirror on the other side of the door, which is a source of natural light. So hanging one on this side of the door would compensate for that. Additionally, this mirror would be directly opposite the large window, so it would be reflecting light from 2 different sources and reflecting the view of the garden. So there's lots of wins from placing a mirror here. Of course, it doesn't have to be circular, but a circle would be good because of all the rectangles that we have going on in the overall space. And next up is that ugly chair. I'd replace that with one that provides good back support while also being more aligned with a living room style, because it is an open plan living space, and this particular corner is always within sight from both the kitchen and the sofa corners. And a chair like this could also be pulled over to the sofa area when you're entertaining guests and look good, while also providing your guests with a comfy seat. Now for the decor pieces and the lighting. I mean, we only want one of these lamps, but I wouldn't actually keep either of them. If I did have to choose between them, it would be the black desk lamp, but I think the scale of this one is too small. So I'd go with something bigger. And in place of the trinkets and tiny plant, I'd add one mid-sized plant, and preferably a real one. You'd be sitting in close quarter to this plant while you're working, and you'll enjoy a real one far more than a fake one. And lastly, you could add a small organisation station. This is purely optional, of course. So here's a quick look at the before and the after for this corner. Okay, let's take a look at the kitchen area, which is currently looking quite cluttered. And we'll start with the high stools. As I already mentioned, I would change these out. Even with the padded cushions, they just don't look super comfy to me. So I'd look for stools with less rigid seating, and I'd also change the colour. There's an awful lot of white in the space as a whole, and that's not a bad choice. It's just there's so much of it that the overall palette feels quite flat. You might have noticed I've introduced the colour green in the other spaces. However, what I'm going to suggest here is not a pair of green stools, but a pair of black stools. Little hits of black can help to have a grounding effect on the energy of a space. And we do have touches of it in the other areas, the TV in the lounge corner, the lamp and mirror frame in the desk corner, And I think it would be helpful to add that bit of contrast here as well. The next thing I'm going to do is remove this tray. It's taking up too much real estate on a surface that would be essential for food prep given the limited counter space behind it. And instead, I would swap it out with a fruit bowl placed over to the side so you're still allowing plenty of free space for prepping or eating your meals. And then I would move that tray over to the top of the fridge and move the kettle and toaster to that spot. We can just about see a socket on the wall there, and by correlating them on a tray, they'll look neater. And this appliance, I'm not sure what it is, but that needs to move to inside one of the cupboards or to the shelf under the island. This wall is the first thing you see when you enter the flat. So we want it to be easier on the eye than it is currently. So this is just to give you a rough idea of how much more calming this could be simply by moving those three appliances off the counter. Now, if I were the landlord, I would actually be extending the counter to cover the washing machine and fridge. It makes no sense to me to have discontinued it where they did. But as a tenant with no say in that matter, I'd use the tray to corral those items and make the surfaces look as neat and clutter-free as possible. The next thing I would do here is add some storage in the form of wall shelves. And again, I'm going to introduce the colour green. And then use them to display cookbooks, maybe some herbs, tea and coffee, your favourite mugs and glasses. Open shelves combine function with aesthetic style, and these would be a very useful addition in this corner. And one last thing I do in this area is I paint the rim of the attic access. For the same reason I mentioned earlier when I was talking about painting radiators, the contrast here draws your eye towards this patch in the ceiling, and it's not exactly an attractive feature. By painting it white, it will disappear. To be honest, I'd also paint the door white too, but I think that might be a stretch for the landlord. I have a feeling they like the effect of the natural wood, and the wood tones do warm up the space. It's just I'm not a fan of knotty pines, so that would be a preference thing for me. Okay, so let's look at a quick before shot and an idea of how the after might look. And another quick look at the lounge area before and after. And lastly, the entryway and work from home before and after. Actually, one last change. I'd paint that chair black. So that's it. That's pretty much what I would do. I would love now to get my hands on the space and implement those changes. Let me know in the comments what you think of them and if you have other ideas, other suggestions, or even if there's something that you think I missed that I didn't address in the space. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like to see me make more videos like this, also let me know. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.